This is our final chapter in the school age section, and we are going to discuss treatment. This chapter focuses on the theoretical models of intervention for this age, as well as considerations that are important when planning treatment for this population. Impact on language disorders. If they have academic problems, then an adolescent may drop out of school. One study showed that 80% of students with academic problems will drop out, and we really don't want that to happen, of course. Once a student drops out, statistics show there is an increased risk for delinquency and arrest. So think about it. If they're not in school, what are they going to do all day? There's also psychosocial and social emotional disorders because they don't feel good about themselves. They often don't have friends. Their potential friends are in school, of course. It can be very difficult for them. Then, of course, without a good education, less opportunity to make money, so their vocational potential is much poorer. Now let's discuss principles of intervention that guides our practice when you're working with a child who is school age. These principles include making goals and intervention activities curriculum-based, which we have already discussed some. And then now we have to focus on oral and written forms because they are learning to write. Include the metas, of course, and then activities and goals can be preventative. So for example, if I can work on a concept orally, maybe it will not have to be a goal in written form. Another example could be a child that I have on my caseload for an articulation disorder, but is in the third tier of RTI, or the response to intervention, for some language concepts. I can build some of those concepts into my articulation activities. For example, a fifth grader has to use verbs, nouns, and adjectives in their writing samples. I might have them write a paragraph using these language forms, giving them a word bank of their S words. Then they have to read their paragraph to me with the correct production of the S. If you're treating a child in the schools, we have to discuss the IEP, which is the Individualized Education Plan. This is the treatment plan in the schools. The IEP is mandated by the IDEA, or the IDEA law. The ARD committee, which stands for Admission, Review, and Dismissal Committee, is responsible for creating the IEP and makes the treatment decisions for the student. You make a recommendation as the speech pathologist and discuss how the student is eligible for services by discussing the results of the assessment and recommended goals. It is the IEP committee that approves those recommendations. The IEP includes the dates of service, which last a full year. If you have an ARD meeting on today, whichever day today is, the goals and everything that you set are good until the following year, one day before. So if this was December 1st, then the goals you write are good until November 30th of the following year. The IEP also specifies where the child is going to be served. I always would put a variety. I would put pull-out setting, in a collaborative, in a classroom setting, if I was going to have direct services. We'll talk more about these in just a little bit. I pretty much like to have that combination so I could have some flexibility. Next, the progress monitoring is how often you are going to report on progress. That typically occurs every 6 weeks if it's a 6-week report card, or 9 weeks if they're in a 9-week report card program. Lastly, the IEP includes an overall statement combining all services the child receives of the current achievement and of the current functioning level where they're at right now. The adolescents have to be involved in their intervention plan. This should occur through talking to the child. Share their results of the assessment. Tell them what you found out about them on their assessment. Help them understand that having a learning disability still means that they are just as smart as everyone else. It's just in this one area that they have difficulty learning in for some reason. School just measures part of their intelligence. You need to remind them. You could have a child with a learning disability who is a fabulous pianist or a fabulous athlete, and you want to make sure that child recognizes that school is very important, but he has a lot of skills that are great. He just struggles in one area, or maybe two or three, but that isn't everything. You're going to work with him to figure out ways to be successful with that difficulty. That's where you talk about why you want to do intervention. You'll ask the child to help you set the goals, like what's the most important to them, what matters to them the most, what seems to impact their life the most. Then you talk to them about how often you'd like them to come to therapy. Because they don't get to pick and choose, you have to direct them and keep them on your side and in agreement with what is going on. They really need to feel like they're part of the team. Then you help them to learn different strategies. Lastly, they're going to be a part of assessing how they are progressing. You will have your session data, but they are the ones that are going to see and report their performance from their entire 24-hour day. So now we're going to talk about the models of intervention, and these are based on the least restrictive environment, or the LRE, which is part of the federal law of IDEA that says the child must be educated where they would be educated if they didn't have a disability. So you have a child who is in the 3rd grade. Where would that child be educated if he didn't have a disability? The 3rd grade classroom, of course. So the general education classroom is considered the least restrictive environment. The following models of intervention are based on that least restrictive environment concept. The most significant restriction that can be put on a child is to pull the child out for therapy. This is the most restrictive and considered the most direct intervention because you're working in isolation with the student individually or in a group. This model is best when trying to teach a discrete and specific skill, and it's often done more at the beginning of the intervention process. The next one would be the collaborative model, where direct services are still provided by the SLP, but in the classroom. Some people call this push-in, when the therapist goes into the classroom. ASHA supports this model as the most efficient and effective model of intervention for students with language-based learning disabilities in the public schools. The teacher and SLP work together to plan curriculum and activities that build the child's goals into specific classroom activities. Often, the SLP will work with a group of children or the entire class on an activity that targets several of those children's goals. The other students might not be on the SLP's caseload, but participate as part of their general education program. The teacher and SLP work close in this model where each is very aware of what the other is doing and how the students are doing with the planned curriculum and their specific goals. The one that is the least restrictive is the consultative model. This is often called indirect intervention also because the SLP is not seeing the child directly. It would be a consultative role to the teacher. Training teachers and others involved in the child's education, either by training on preventative information or indirect intervention methods for the teacher or the aides. This model often happens when the child is towards the end of the intervention process with the SLP. Therapy in the schools is most often going to be in a group setting because of the number of children on an SLP's caseload. A school day is usually organized into a block schedule. All of you should still remember this. All of the classes are at the same time each day. So 1 to 1:30 might be when you see all of the 1st graders. 1:32 might be when the SLP or you sees a group of 2nd graders. Whatever class they're from, that's the only common thing about them. That results in what they call stair-step groups. You may have a child in there who's working on a speech sound disorder. You might have a child in there with a fluency issue. Then there might be a child with language, syntax, and morphology issues. Then you might have a child who's got poor vocabulary, so you're working on semantics. So the children could all be working on something different, but the SLP is going to choose an activity that can be modified to work with the specific stimulus items each child needs to work on for their specific goals. So let's look at an example. So if you have one child who is working on answering WH questions, then a child with a speech sound disorder, you're going to work on the child with the speech sound disorder answering questions that contain the sounds he's working on. If you have the child with fluency, then you're going to work on him being fluent and managing his behavior for fluency when answering questions. So the stimulus item is a question for each child. And then maybe you plan a drill play format in which each child answers their respective question and then gets to take a turn at a game. One benefit of the group therapy format is that the children are good models for each other. The child with fluency difficulties is going to hear models of fluent sentences from the other children. The child with the speech sound disorder is going to hear correct models of his targeted sound. This is a lot of reinforcement of their targets during the session. Another structure that an SLP can do with group therapy is to have stations within therapy. So the SLP might have 6 children coming in a group and have 2 doing an activity that is set up that has to do with their speech and language. Then 2 do another activity while the SLP works directly with them. And then the 2 other children have a separate activity that they do. And then the children will rotate through. So you work, or the SLP works with 2 of them for 10 minutes, and then they rotate the next 2 for 10 minutes, and so on. For data collection, a very specific or strategic way is to use chips and cups to keep track of individual student responses. So instead of trying to tally on a data collection form, which you would have, in this instance, 6 different data collection forms, you could just have 6 different cups. The SLP can have a stack of enough chips, maybe 20 chips. When the child gets it correct, a chip is dropped into his cup. In the end, then they go back and see how many chips he has instead of trying to keep track on that piece of paper, your data collection form. So often also you don't have to data collect the entire session. So often school SLPs will data collect at the beginning of the session and at the end of the session, or at least once a week in group therapy. So maybe you data collect when they are there in front of you, if you're doing the stations, and then the other 2 stations, obviously you're not there to data collect. There are a lot of options for classroom accommodations to help the child function and be more successful in the classroom. The art team will come up with these and will include them in the IEP. If it is written in the IEP, then they have to be carried out in the classroom or in your therapy session. Excuse me. So some accommodations can include written instructions in bullet style, copy of class notes and then overheads, multiple choice questions, or reduce the number of choices or the number of questions, extra time for homework or taking tests, break assignments into smaller steps, repetition of information, frequent checks for understanding, and the use of visual aids. Next, we're going to discuss the models of school-based intervention and getting ready for, no, sorry. Now we're going to discuss the treatment planning, some of the different aspects that go into that. You've already learned that goals are determined through assessment and assessment drives intervention. Then also, throughout therapy, you're always using assessment to monitor how well the child is doing, and this monitoring tells you how much extra assistance the child needs. Appropriate goals need to be meaningful, have to provide lots of opportunity to practice outside the therapy room, and of course, they must be achievable. This achievement part is where planning the appropriate levels of assistance and then fading them at the appropriate times is important. We begin where the child is at with the appropriate teaching supports, which will help him produce the target correctly. Then we decrease the level of support until the child is able to do the skill independently. Most of the time, we are not done there. Then we increase the complexity or difficulty of the skill. Then we increase that complexity. We also add back a lot of support. Then we gradually decrease the support and cueing until the child can do that level of skill independently. And then again, we move up to the next level of complexity for that skill, or maybe a new skill, but that process just keeps continuing. So what do we teach? This is a link to the Texas Education Agency with the TEKS, which is the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. This will show you what is in the curriculum for the Texas schools, what the children need to learn through the grade 5. If you're working in the state of Texas in a public school, you're required to match your goals as an SLP to the curriculum goals. I have put this link in the materials section of Canvas. Take a minute now to pause the video and go look through this link. I think it's easier to look at the objectives by grade level versus by subject as an SLP. So when you are on the website, scroll down to the bottom and find the objectives for each grade level. Look at the first grade and kind of scroll through there and see what skills are required. And then I want you to look at the 5th grade section so you can kind of see the differences in skills that are required for a 1st and then a 5th grader. And then after you do this, I want you to come back to this slide of the PowerPoint, and we're going to talk about a few things that you looked at. Now that you're a little oriented to the text, let's discuss the 2 ways in which an SLP would use these. First is to compare the weaknesses found on the student's assessment to the expectations and what the child is working on in class through those text competencies. Sometimes the text objectives and your goals might be the same or very similar. The text will help guide or help you prioritize as the SLP the weaknesses found in your evaluation. I'm going to give an example on the next slide. The next way to use the text is to help you choose the activities or themes when you're working on your goals. Let's say the student has an expressive vocabulary goal. You might be building vocabulary about a theme or topic of focus in the text. I know with the kindergarten or 1st graders, each week they usually have a theme. So if they're doing community helpers in their classroom that week, then when you have those children in therapy, it's important that you talk about firefighters, nurses or doctors, teachers, etc. It doesn't really matter what their goal is. If it's just learning the names of them or making up sentences or writing stories, you're going to use that theme in your therapy activities. So you can adapt their goals to fit within these themes. This also, if you look at the text, it will also give you some ideas of some goals that you would write that would be appropriate for a child that age, especially in the 5th grader ones. So let's go back to using the text to help prioritize the weaknesses found on your evaluation. So for this example, take this text objective I took out of the 5th grade competencies. Oral and written conventions and I don't know why it's there twice, conventions. Students understand the function of and use of the convention of academic language when speaking and writing. Students continue to apply earlier standards with greater complexity. Students are expected to use and understand the function of the following parts of speech in context of reading, writing, and speaking. So verbs, irregular and active voice, collective nouns, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, and prepositional phrases to convey location, time, direction, or to use or to provide details, indefinite pronouns, subordinating conjunctions, transitional words. So I see here the text expects a 5th grader to use irregular verbs and active voice in oral and written forms. If either of these are a weakness found through my assessment, then I will probably write these as a goal. So as you can see in the schools, the educational curriculum and the SLP's goals definitely have to be very coordinated, because couldn't you see really any of that list that I read being a goal for a child on an SLP's caseload? This slide is a reminder on the meta skills because these develop in school age children. You don't bring these in so much with the preschoolers, but we will in school age. When you work with a school age student, you look at helping them to self-monitor. So often a child with a learning disability doesn't know that he doesn't know. Think about it. You have to help him learn to identify that and apply strategies. They also need help with problem solving and how to complete a task. You teach them to complete a task analysis and then set up a step-by-step process to solve the problem. Organization, keeping a notebook, and all those things are very, very helpful, and they need to learn to work independently. The treatment sequence for working with school-age children is the same as it is for every other age group. You first select your behaviors based on assessment, of course. Then you take a baseline and using dynamic assessment where you see how much support the child needs. Next, you will write a long-term goal or goals and then short-term goals, starting with your baseline, advancing towards the long-term goal. Next is selecting the materials for the intervention. With the school-age children, sometimes you have to plan how generalization is going to occur, or how are you going to train that child to use the new skills functionally in their everyday environments. Remember, generalization is using those skills in other environments and with other people. I would like to say that this all comes naturally, but it often does not, either because the child does not have good self-evaluation skills or reverts back to old habits in the natural environment. Lastly is the maintenance plan, where the speech pathologist backs away and sees the child fewer and fewer times so that the child becomes very independent. This acronym, RISE, is essentially the basis for all intervention. First, intervention needs repeated opportunities. Goals should be ones that the child will come across in their daily life so they have repeated opportunities to use their new skills. The intensely delivered means you want to work, 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 and do a little bit more work. Don't waste time. This isn't playtime. This is hard work time. Now, a good SLP is going to make that hard work time fun, but it is still very intense therapy. Next, the SLP will want to make sure that the support is given and gradually and systematically reduced. Then, specific and explicit targets that the child is aware of is crucial. Next, we're going to discuss a few aspects that are important in intervention with elementary age, and then we will do the same thing with older adolescents. Here with the intervention with elementary age, our predominant focus is on literacy skills. And then we're also going to have increasingly complex written and oral language skills. And then the use of narratives, as we've learned in the last chapter, is part of the instructional protocol for teaching more advanced language forms. So these are definitely different than what we had focused on at the preschool level. Preschool was really just our basic language concepts, right? In our developing all of our sounds. Now we're getting to the higher complex language skills and narratives. And then you can guess the later we're going to build in the writing. So, literature-based intervention, this is going to be huge starting in school age. So, our book selection, we are going to choose a book and we're going to read in about 10 minutes, one that we can read in about 10 minutes. And we would love that book to contain multiple episodes within it, multiple episodes that happen. So the components that we are going to discuss during this book are components of the literate-based intervention. Is first talking about pre-story knowledge. So this activates any prior knowledge that they're going to have to pull in when reading the story or listening to the story. We're often going to use graphic organizers, and so this is just a visual way for them to organize information that they know that's going to be used in the story. So semantic maps, so this word is related to this word to help them kind of remember and understand possibly the sequence of things. Then we're going to have a pre-story discussion. So we're going to have some questions that are follow-up from our semantic map or our graphic organizer. And we're going to use oral descriptions of pictures and the use of vertical structuring. Then we're going to have shared reading. Everyone's going to take their turn and do some reading of our story. Then we're going to have a component which is called the post-story comprehension discussion. So this is where we are just first going to talk about what is the literal meaning of this story. But then, especially as they get older, we're going to have more inferential components, maybe some abstract language components that we're going to want to talk through and kind of tell them and discuss how that it fits into the literal structure that we understood. And then definitely going through those different story grammar components that we talked about in narrative. So what's the setting? What's the problem? Then what was our resolution? I mean, there's more parts there, but all of those story grammar components. Next, we're going to do this focus skill activities. So these are just different activities that we are going to build our goals really kind of into this part, okay? So we've really learned about the story. You know, maybe some of our goals fit in those first parts of the literature-based intervention. But here we can really put some different things in. So if they have some pragmatic goals, we can really talk about maybe how the character handled the problem. We could role play different situations that maybe could have happened compared to what happened in the story. So maybe if a character handled something not appropriately, the kids could come up with an appropriate situation and then role play that. Or maybe the character did do it correctly, but then they could come up with some less appropriate, then that way they're really thinking about it. That's really using some nice meta skills. And then, then just discussing when it's okay to do something, not okay to do something, just whatever the story lends to. And then, of course, we can build any syntax, any narrative goals, any semantic goals. So, if there are certain vocabulary words in there that I want to target, I'm going to pull those out and we will do certain activities with them to work on the semantics. Then the last part of the literature-based intervention is parallel story. So this is where we reread the book and repeated story retelling. So we're going to reread it, but then we're going to repeat it and maybe change it in certain ways, okay? So we might make a semantic map and we might add some new words to change up our story a little bit. We might make pictographs. Remember, we talked about pictographs. Actually, I think that was in another class I did. But a pictograph is essentially, I start with basic components of my story, and then I'm add a little bit of detail to that. So I have a girl. Well, what does the girl look like? She had blonde hair, blue eyes. So we're going to and draw this as we go. And as we're drawing this and we add more and more details to our drawing or our pictograph, what are we doing? We're adding details to our story, right? Or details, we're thinking through details that can be added to our story. So then we're going to create a parallel story. So maybe some different characters, some different circumstances, some different words. We're going to use a graphic organizer to help us organize our new story. But it's one that's similar, but it's different. So that is a holistic approach of how we can use literature to work on some of our different goals. Now we're going to talk about some issues or components when we are working with adolescents. With adolescents, this is again where I talked about they start to develop their meta skills for sure, their abstract concepts. They're becoming independent. They're learning how to learn rather than what to learn. They're very much aware of their limitations at this age. They have to learn to regulate their own behavior for sure. They have to be able to plan, organize, anticipate, and have critical thinking skills about their behaviors and about others' behaviors. All of this starts coming in the third or fourth grade, but we're going to have big changes in children in fourth, and then definitely in sixth, and then definitely into the adolescence with this. Adolescents are going to be pretty expected to have all of this fairly in place. When they become teenagers, that's when they really become responsible for themselves, or they're expected to. That's what you want them to do is for them to take over responsibility for themselves and really kind of their therapy. They start to they start to develop a lot of values, their own self-independent values, separate from kind of their teachers and their parents. They're individuals and they have their social world that is so important to them, and I hate to say it is much more important than family sometimes. Usually in high school, we don't do the pull-out model with the students. Academic demands are high, and therefore the pull-out model should be considered very carefully and really used with caution. There is also social repercussions of a older teenager being pulled out for therapy. So this is where an SLP might really do a collaborative or a consultative method in terms of giving ideas and suggestions to the teachers. We're going to model and use that with the teachers. Helping the teachers understand the strategies that they can use in the classroom to help the child. But the SLP is always an important member of the student's academic team at this age. So when working with an adolescent, written language is very important. Working on written language is just as important as oral language with this age. The metacognitive skills of planning what they're going to write and being aware of whom they're writing for, this information is very important. The SLP spends a lot of time with editing and paraphrasing with the students. Of course, working on phonological skills are important also. Functionally, we will see these skills in their spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Most teaching in middle and high school by the teachers is through oral presentation, right? So management of auditory processing difficulties, we've already discussed a lot of these, but just to bring them back and the importance of this at this age. So we're first, of course, going to modify the environment. So really the use of remote microphone technology in the school and home is very important. Improving the acoustics in the classroom, and then maybe doing preferential seating, and even using a listening buddy, maybe someone to listen, take notes, those kind of things. Perceptual training is the actual therapy targeting the auditory processing skills we learned about in the APD chapter. So this is the temporal gap discrimination, intensity, frequency, and duration discrimination, just to name a few. Then we have the compensatory training to help develop auditory skills, such as working on auditory memory and speech, sound discrimination, and noise. Lastly is cognitive training, which focuses on monitoring and self-regulation skills needed for message comprehension and problem solving. This would include following direction, using written notes, asking relevant questions, and then, of course, answering questions. So that pretty much wraps up what we're going to focus on in the school age. But a big part of school age is transitioning from school special education services to what are they going to do in adulthood. So let's talk about some of these dynamics. So IDEA law requires schools to begin planning transition to adult services at age 14. That's young, huh? The child can receive special education services under IDEA until age 22. So he can complete the school year during which he turns 22. So if he turns 22 in August, he cannot begin school, but if he turns 22 in September, he can begin the school and continue throughout that entire school year. So once the individual is 22 and leaves services under IDEA, then he can receive services and accommodations under the American with Disabilities Act, or the ADA Act. During these transition meetings, these aspects are taken into consideration for the child's future. What are any further education needs or plans? Is the child going to continue on to a junior college or a four-year university, or do they want to attend some type of vocational training program? If further schooling is not the plan, is the child ready for employment or needs further training to find employment? In Texas, we have the Texas Workforce Commission, which is a state-funded program that helps individuals be successful in finding employment. This might first be assisting with college readiness and success, then vocational training to get them ready for interviewing employment. This is a government-funded agency in which I see is often understaffed, so the process in dealing with them is often very slow, but it's a good resource, especially when the child and the family needs financial assistance in obtaining some of these services. The team is also going to look at the individual's readiness for independent living. And does the individual have the skills to be an active participant in the community? Also, has the individual acquired the daily living skills so that he can take care of himself and live on his own? And then there are any related services that can help the individual meet their goals after high school. As previously discussed, students are invited to the annual team meetings, which is called the ARD, or the Admissal Review Dismissal Meeting. It's important the child attend at least the last meeting because their care is now going to be their responsibility, not a team's or their parents'. On or before their 17th birthday, the child and parents must be informed of the parental rights to transfer to students at age 18. The age of majority and the individual can make all of their own decisions, education, medical, and life decisions. In my experience, this happens earlier during the transition period than at 17. If the parents feel that they have to obtain custodial rights, this is a fairly lengthy process that they will often start much before long before their 18th birthday. During this last transition meeting, the team must discuss the final graduation plans and the final steps in the course of the study for the student to graduate. On this last slide, I just wanted to bring up a few other things that are kind of talked about during this transition time. Guardianship, I mentioned that on the last slide. So some students, when they turn 18, might not have the mental capacity to be fully responsible for themselves. And so there is a legal process that the parents have to go through that does transfer that guardianship to them from the individual. And that's what takes, it's a legal process. And so nothing legal is quick, right? So it takes a while to get that going. Then setting up a trust. A lot of families want to set this up, especially if the child is not going to be independently living and making their own money when they're older. We do have SSI, so individuals with disabilities can get money from SSI. So that is something that is a process also to see if they qualify for. Really looking at the individual safety and what are their executive functioning skills, what are their problem solving skills, and their ability to be safe on a daily basis. And then there are adult services, like we said, the American Disabilities Act definitely has provisions for individuals with disabilities and at the adult age. And there are different services that are federally and state funded that they could qualify for. I have definitely found usually the Texas Workforce Commission is probably the best to help identify which of those are helpful for the client. So that is the end of this chapter. And like I said, we are done with kids now, and we are going to spend the rest of the semester talking about adults in language. All right, see you next week.